Hello, welcome back to the channel. I have a fun but pretty different video for you today. So a little while ago, maybe like two-ish, 2.5 months ago, I made a video talking about whether bans work in TCG or whether they're even the right approach for managing TCG formats and how you maintain the health. And in that video, I talked pretty briefly about the most recent Yu-Gi-Oh ban list, but I basically made the conceit that I didn't understand enough about Yu-Gi-Oh really to be able to speak like really confidently about it or anything like that. And by extension, I didn't feel comfortable talking about Yu-Gi-Oh Genesys when Yu-Gi-Oh Genesys came out. And we're in some ways, I think, some of the best positioned content creators to kind of like talk about that format because we are people who have been playing a uh, TCG format that has been regulated by a points list for longer than anyone else has. There are not a lot of games that use a points list. It's, Canadian Highlander, Australian Highlander. There's also, I want to give a special shout out to the Kingdoms TCG, which is actually one that's kind of local to me, which also uses a points list to manage their game, which I thought I was intrigued to discover. But I didn't know enough about Yu-Gi-Oh to be able to talk about Genesis in a way that I thought would be really fair. I think it's really easy to kind of like spend an hour or two trying to learn a game and then draw conclusions from that short period of time. And I didn't want to do that. I felt like that would be in bad faith. So I did what any reasonable person would do, and I learned how to play Yu-Gi-Oh. So the last 2 months or so, I've been in the lab. I've been learning how to play Yu-Gi-Oh. So this is obviously Master Duel. This is Yu-Gi-Oh's digital client. It is not a bad digital client, I gotta say, all things considered. If people are interested, I can do a different video about what learning to play Yu-Gi-Oh was like, because it was an interesting experience to say the least. I've learned how to play a bunch of TCGs. I love card games. They're like my favorite thing. And if people want to hear my thoughts, I'm more than happy to talk about them. But yeah, in short, I learned how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! In order to be able to speak confidently about this. I'm not like incredible. In the first, I've been playing for basically 2 months. In my first month, I hit Diamond 5, and this month I'm most of the way to Master. Um, and those are the ranks where you actually have to have a positive win rate to rank up. So like I'm winning more games than I lose. I think I have a decent understanding of what's going on with the game now, at least enough that I feel confident talking to you about Yu-Gi-Oh Genesis, their points managed format, and talking about what I think they could maybe learn from Canadian Highlander and what Canadian Highlander can learn from that format. So let's look quickly at what Genesis even is, because this is kind of an interesting thing. When the format was introduced to Yu-Gi-Oh players, it was introduced conceptually as, sorry, I'm on the wrong article. It was introduced conceptually as, hey, we're making another format so that you can get into the game more easily, right? So who is Genesis for? This is this kind of intro to Genesis article. And it says, duelists looking for a less complicated game. If you're new to the game, anybody who's looking for a new experience, this is all very reasonable. And so the goal of this Genesis format, of this points managed Yu-Gi-Oh format, is to have a simpler, and what's kind of implied by this is lower power level. For context, Yu-Gi-Oh is a very high power, pretty zero sum game. A lot of games are decided on the first or second turn of the game functionally. Like sometimes you have to play one more turn after that to technically end the game, but a lot of games end in one or two turns. There is interaction, and I'm not dogging on Yu-Gi-Oh at all. Like there is interaction, there is skill expression, but it's very compressed. And as a result, when you're learning, especially, if you make one mistake, the game just ends. And so it can be a very challenging game to learn, and a very challenging game to understand, because it is so high power in the one format that exists for Yu-Gi-Oh. That's I think another important piece of context here. Genesis represents the only other currently officially supported Yu-Gi-Oh format. There are some like they call them time wizard formats, which are kind of like pre-modern in Magic, where they're formats that are frozen at a certain set of time of cards. So it's like nothing after 2005 or whatever. There are a couple formats like that, but those are not as officially endorsed by Konami. This one is. Okay, so what did Genesys do different from Canadian Highlander? Obviously, like they're not going to have been looking at Canadian Highlander for inspiration or anything like that. But I think it is pretty interesting that they came to this similar conclusion that a points list would be a effective way to manage the format. So first things first, they opted for, I think it's in this article here. No, these are just details about tournaments, huh? All right, so I'll go here. So they opted for a point system with 100 points. So you can see their points list is very long, and you have cards that appear on every level of that points list, right? Like you have things as high as 100, you have things as low as 1. There's not a card at literally every value because at a certain point the increments lose value, but there's a lot of 1, a lot of like there's a lot of numbers that end in 1, a lot of numbers that end in 3, and a lot of numbers that end in 7 and 5. Those are the really common numbers, I guess. There's also like some 6s as well. Like there's a bunch of like really like reasonably cheap cards that you can play. There's actually only 1 6, and it's exactly Nibiru. Interesting. But yeah, so like, you know, some cheaper cards, some way more expensive cards down at the 100 range, and then some stuff in that middle range, like between 50 and 100. So we can kind of extrapolate this to what we did when we changed from a 7-point system to a 10-point system, which is that we really wanted granularity. We wanted the ability to manage which cards players had to choose about putting in their deck. And we were running into this problem with the 7-point list where cards felt like they were worth half a point, and putting them on the list felt awful, but taking them off the list or keeping them off the list also felt bad. And so we went to 10 points, and 10 points has worked very well for Canadian Highlander, all things considered. This is a much more drastic approach. And the reason for it, I think, is that they needed more granularity and they needed more points because rather than being a 100 card singleton format with a very short points list, like our points list by comparison, I've just got the history of the points list doc pulled up here, and I think this is updated. It is not. Mystical is not too, but this is a relatively recent points list, right? Like our number of cards is 1/10 of the number of cards that's on this Yugioh Genesys list, maybe even less. So obviously they need more granularity to be able to allow people to actually build decks. And then the other part of it is that this is a 40 card 3 of game, so you actually can include up to 3 of a card in your deck. So there's more of a need for a higher point count to be able to include like multiples of certain things. So I want to talk about the one kind of fatal flaw that I see with Genesys, and this is something that Yu-Gi-Oh content creators have started to kind of reckon with in the last couple of weeks. There have been a number of points updates to the Yu-Gi-Oh Genesys list since the format was announced. The format was announced, I believe, in September, something like that. And then there was a first initial adjustment. No, it was August. It was initially, yeah, announced in August. Is that right? September. It was in September. And then there were some changes immediately. There's been 2 other points updates since then. And you can see, obviously, they are extremely early in the format's kind of development and management. So they're gonna make bigger swings. They need to make big changes. So you can see really a lot of changes. And obviously I'm not going to talk granularly about any of these particular changes, but I do want to talk about the issues that I see. So what's happened is that the intended purpose of the Yu-Gi-Oh Genesys format has been to create a quote lower power level and easier entry level format for new Yu-Gi-Oh players. And there's like obviously like theoretically other people it's for, but I do think that ostensibly the goal is to make this the lower power officially supported Yu-Gi-Oh format. They want games where you have multiple turns, you get to take multiple draw steps, you get to do things where you don't necessarily lose the game for making one wrong choice on the second turn of the game or something like that. And I don't think that Genesys is properly equipped to achieve those goals. And I think that Highlander actually stands to learn from that and maybe not necessarily try fall down these same pitfalls. So I want to talk, I guess, first about, does this make the game simpler for new players? And I think in point of fact, it just can't. Because when you're talking about deck construction, Yu-Gi-Oh! Already actually has a relatively complicated entry point for deck construction. For reference, cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Can be banned, limited, or semi-limited, meaning that you can play any number of 0, 1, 2, or 3 of a card in your deck. Like there are 4 possible states for a card to be in, which is already kind of a confusing thing to explain to a new player. But at least with a hard number, you can just say, hey, you're only allowed to have one. What's a good example? You're only allowed to have one Max C in your deck, which is like a powerful hand trap, and that's actually a recent change in Master Duel that they've gone down to 1. But you can say to someone, you're only allowed to have one of this card. What we have always kind of had anxiety about in the Canadian Highlander format is that adding too many pointed cards to the points list would make entry into the format too complicated, because you would spend too much time just trying to unpack what cards you're even allowed to play based on the points list. And if you look at the way that this list is structured, like, this is a giant tome of points that you need to go through. And if you're an enfranchised, experienced Yu-Gi-Oh! Player, this is not that bad. I don't think at all, because you recognize the vast majority of these cards. You understand why they're pointed relationally to each other in a lot of cases. But if you're new and you're trying to build decks, this is not super comprehensible. So that's one thing I would say right away is, like, if their goal was to create an easier to access format, just from a simple like deck building perspective, this is a much harder format to access from a deck building standpoint. And we see that in Canadian Highlander as well, to a much lower extent. But you know, it is challenging to start from scratch building a Highlander deck. The reality is that now you can largely look at like a core of 50 odd cards that should probably be in your deck of a various color combination, and then flavor it in a way that you like, and that's relatively accessible. But in Yu-Gi-Oh! That's not the case. It's much more complicated to approach, I think, what you could actually be building. You have to do a lot of, oh, what about this strategy that I saw not in the Genesis format? Is it playable in Genesis? I have to go check for each card in the deck to see if it's pointed. It's complicated. It is. And if you're an experienced player, it's not. But if you are not an experienced player, I think it is quite challenging to approach. The next issue that the Genesis format has run into is an issue of power level. So despite the intended goal of the format to be lower power, be more approachable, they specifically excluded, and this is requires explaining Yu-Gi-Oh! A little bit more, but they explicitly excluded Link and Pendulum monsters. And what Link and Pendulum monsters are, I'll just show you really quick. I knew I left this open for a good reason. So what Link and Pendulum monsters are, in Yu-Gi-Oh!, you have your main deck with your main deck cards, but at any given time, you are able to summon monsters from your extra deck. These are just cards that you always have access to 100% of the time, and they have specific conditions for their summoning. So like, for example, the Gallant Granite takes 2 level 4 monsters, and you can summon this out of the extra deck. So these kinds of monsters have existed for a long time. This is what's called an Xyz monster, XYZ. There are also fusion monsters. These are the purple ones. These usually take a specific spell to summon. There are synchro monsters that also have a specific summoning condition. But the 2 newest additions to these extra deck monsters are Link monsters, which don't require a spell. They don't really work the same way as Xyz or synchro monsters, because they just come into play. You don't have to have, in the case of synchro monsters, you need a tuner and a non-tuner, for example, which is a creature type. I'm getting too in the weeds. But suffice it to say, Link monsters have basically been accused of being too complicated or breaking the game. They oftentimes make bridging between different combos very easy, because typically their summoning restrictions aren't very high. And then the other one, the big one that a lot of enfranchised Yu-Gi-Oh! Players or older Yu-Gi-Oh! Players really were up in arms about, when they were released are these cards called pendulum monsters. These are really weird. They exist both. They can be both a monster and a spell. You have scales. So you basically have like a number. You put it on each side of the battlefield. And if you have, you can then summon monsters that cost in between the values of the two pendulum monsters. And it's largely been viewed as this kind of like turning point of unapproachability for the game. So that's why Genesys is getting rid of those things. It's trying to lower the power level and it's trying to lower the complexity. In practice, though, that's just not what it's done. Because if you go and you look at the average Yu-Gi-Oh deck in Advanced, in the regular kind of like normal Yu-Gi-Oh format that people have been playing for a long time, the best decks are almost always decks that are playing the engines from the last couple of sets of Yu-Gi-Oh cards. And engine has a bit of a different connotation in Yu-Gi-Oh than it does in Magic. In Magic, we might think of an engine as like Asmo, Underworld Cookbook, and maybe like Academy Manufactor, where like, okay, I've assembled this engine where if I discard a card, I get a clue, a treasure, and a clue, a treasure. What's the other one you get? I don't even know. Wow. I'm such a oh, and a food. You get a food, the thing you would actually get from Cookbook, obviously, right? That's an engine. You're getting more material than you would normally. You throw in like a Daredevil, and that gets itself back every time an artifact comes into play, and you got yourself an engine. In Yu-Gi-Oh, engine is a lot more is a lot more broad. Engine basically means anything that you are doing that is proactive. And in a lot of cases in modern Yu-Gi-Oh contexts, an engine is one card and then subsequently a bunch of other cards that you have to include in your main and extra deck that will allow you to get to whatever your like end board final game plan is. So what in practice happens most of the time in the normal Advanced Yu-Gi-Oh format is that engines printed in the last couple of years tend to be the most powerful. And that's true right now. Like, for example, one of the better decks in the format right now, if I go back to Master Duel, is this deck called Yummy Mitsurugi. And both of these engines are quite new. They're like released in the last year, I think maybe year and a half, something like that. But they're quite new. And these cards basically, like, by including these in my deck, if I draw more or less any one of like this card of these cards, I'm going to get to build a big end board. That's an engine. So what that means is that despite the fact that you're trying to manage what engines people can build with this points list, and many of the cards I just showed, by the way, are on this points list. You can't play them in Genesys as it stands. But what happens is the points list is structured in a way currently that it is trying to artificially lower the power level of the format in a way that is not really sustainable, because every time new archetypes are released and new engines are released, those are likely going to be the most powerful things, or they're going to be close at the very least. And in a format like Genesys, where the format is managed by a points list, these new cards release at 0. They are too good, like way too good at 0. And as a result, there's just going to be this period of time in which the new engine fundamentally breaks the format while people are allowed to play it for 0, while everything else, every other like playable engine, has a points cost on it. And we've kind of seen that in Canadian Highlander, right? Like, not to the same extent, by any means. I'm going to go full cam for a second here. Not to the same extent by any means, but I want to pull up the actual Highlander points list. But, you know, when MH3 was printed, and when we had kind of that state of the format before there were those big kind of sweeping changes that happened in January of 2025, it was just a situation where most of the new cards that were printed were pretty much defining what the metagame was like. And if you try to play whack-a-mole and knock all of those cards down, I think that you are just going to end up in a situation where the best decks end up being the ones that have the most recently printed powerful cards. And we have seen that bear out in the Canadian Highlander format. So we did this big sweeping change in January 2025. We tried to lower the power level of the format. We pointed a bunch of fair cards. Let's go all the way down here. We pointed a bunch of fair cards. Oh my god, this document is 50 pages long. Okay. You know, we pointed all these fair cards. Minx and Boo, Psychic Frog, Reanimate, Urza Saga, White Plume Adventurer. We also pointed Ren and Six not that long before this. And this was largely in an effort to lower the power level. And in practice, what this did is it made it so that, you know, specifically red-green decks were worse. It, for a time, made it so that black decks were worse. I think Psychic Frog is the one point of these 5 points that's like a slam dunk. It was correct. But the other 4 basically just prescriptively pushed us in the direction of what the correct way to build the kind of like fair, quote unquote, decks in the format was. There is a reason why for the last year, one like the most dominant fair deck in the format was Jeskai. And it's because when you look at these changes, Jeskai was the one that didn't get any changes. And then MH3 printed Tamio. We've had Wan Shitong get printed. We had Stock Up get printed. It's not super feasible to stay on top of the power level of fair decks by trying to point the new cards. You're going to run into issues with that unless you are extremely reactive, which we have not been. And Genesys has had the same problem. So I mentioned that like in this hypothetical, if you are someone, if you're playing the format and a new set comes out and that new set releases this brand new archetype, that archetype is going to enter the game unpointed. And Yu-Gi-Oh is different from Magic in the sense that Yu-Gi-Oh sets release like whole baked archetypes in one set that are intended to compete at the most competitive level possible. Sometimes they happen over like 2 or 3 sets. They have to like supplementally get a few more cards to really hit playability and to be like metagame factors. But in general, archetypes are designed all in one go to be played in the format as is. And so what that means is that for Genesys, it's even worse than in Canadian Highlander, right? Because in Canadian Highlander, we want to run into these issues where it's like, yeah, okay, like we've had too many good blue cards printed in the last year. And as a result, I think there's a general feeling in the format that blue is very good, that combo is kind of too good, similarly because they got a bunch of good blue cards, and that specifically like green mid-range is in a pretty horrific position because their cards got pointed and they didn't get anything printed. That gets exacerbated in a Yu-Gi-Oh! Genesys context where when a new engine gets printed, a new archetype gets printed, all of a sudden that's usually going to be one of the best things to do in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Genesys format. So this is just a deck list I pulled up from one of the most recent Genesys tournaments I could find online. This is a deck that made top 4. There were 2 other decks of the same archetype. This is Cool Tune is what the archetype is called. This is quite new. This archetype is like from either the most recent set or I think maybe it's 1 set previous and it's getting more support now. And like you can look at the point values in this deck. They are spending almost no points on their actual like quote unquote names, like the Cool Tune cards. They have these ones are 5, so they're spending basically like 30 points on their engine, and then they get to spend everything else on what's called non-engine. And non-engine is what we would just think of in Magic as like interactive spells. So the most powerful interactive spells in Genesys are pointed very highly, but if your engine doesn't cost very many points, then you get to have access to much more high quality interaction than the average other deck might. And I should even point out, like this is 5 now, but that's a change. Like that happened in October that they had to, I believe, put the, is it, or December even? Yeah, it was December. This happened in December that these Cool Tune cards went to 5. And previously they weren't. And the deck was even more broken because its engine cost 0 and it was just playing nothing but interactive spells for all 100 of its points. Similarly, like when the format came out, there were complaints that there was this deck called Dracotail, that's another like very powerful fair deck. And at the point of release, like when Genesis came out, Dracotail was just playable in its like basically exactly the same way that you would play it in the normal Yu-Gi-Oh format, and it was like a tier 1 deck in the normal Yu-Gi-Oh format. So there's things like that they're gonna run into, and I think that it is fundamentally a a challenging position to be in for them because, for us, the changes are gradual. A couple of better blue cards get pointed. We start to see the metagame shift, but we can adjust. We can make changes. The most recent Highlander points change put Mystical to 2. That is a nerf to those blue decks that I was talking about that got a bunch of cards this year. Maybe they need another point still, but that's, that could be done. But that didn't like fundamentally break the format. But Genesis is going to break any time that they print an archetype that is new and competitive. Like there's just going to be a period of time where the format is going to feel unplayable. And so for that reason, I'm not sure that the points list is the right approach for building the format that they want to build. My kind of thesis in this whole video is I don't think you can use a points list to really aggressively dictate the power level of a format if you are going to like allow certain things to be legal. So one conversation that I've seen coming up in the Highlander Discord is like, oh, there's all these old cards that I used to be able to play 5 years ago. Like, I wish we could make points changes to the point where those cards would be playable again. And that's just not feasible. Like, the format is a living format. Things are going to age out. And if we are accepting this conceit of, we're going to allow Moxen, we're going to allow the Power 9 to be legal in our format, that is inherently accepting that our format is going to be quite high power, and that when new similarly high power cards get printed, like it's not feasible to try and stamp out every single one so that we can continue playing 2016 Highlander or something like that. It's just not a thing that I think is possible or would be very good. We don't want to end up with a super long list. So yeah, that's all I really had to say about this. I think that Yugioh Genesys is a really cool idea, and I think that it's a really interesting concept, but I think in practice it has not been executed really the way that I think Konami would hope for, and that's been borne out. Like, content creators in the Yu-Gi-Oh space are a little bit disaffected. Like, the community is a little bit disaffected with the format. It's been out for about 6 months now, and it really hasn't taken in the way that I think you would really hope for. I guess the one other thing I would like to, I should point out, actually, there was one other thing I wanted to talk about, is that the other thing that Genesis is doing about with its points list that's very different from Canadian Highlander is that, yes, this is a points list, but it's also kind of a banned list. And that's also problematic, I think, from a standpoint of like, if you're secretly just making a banned list, like maybe why are we using a points list anyway? It seems like it introduces unnecessary complexity for the sake of being novel. So like, for example, this Ame no Habakiri no Mitsurugi card is 100 points, which means it would take your entire deck of points to play one of these. So you don't get to play any of the really premium interaction. But hey, maybe this is like the imaginary situation in Canadian Highlander where Time Vault costs 10. And we say, hey, Time Vault is so good that if you play Time Vault, you are not allowed to play any other cards that are on the points list. But you could play Time Vault and you would still have untappers and it would still theoretically work. The thing about this card, and I'm so glad I left Master Duel open. God, I feel like such a genius. So this is that deck. This is the card. Um, this card requires other things in the deck to work, right? So Yu-Gi-Oh engines aren't just one card; they typically are a package of cards. And so in this case, uh, Habakiri, which is what it's kind of shortened to most of the time, needs you to have a Mitsurugi ritual in your deck, and it needs you kind of to have access to Mitsurugi prayers as well, in order to actually like do the thing that makes this card powerful. Without access to these cards, this card does nothing. It is functionally a useless card. So you would think, if we're using that approach that I had kind of talked about, like, okay, in the hypothetical of we want Time Vault to be 10, we think it's that powerful, we would leave Voltaic Key at 0, right? But what you will find if you hit the old control find on Mitsurugi here is that both prayers and ritual are at 51, which means in addition to not being able to play them alongside Habakiri, which is, as previously mentioned, like the card that makes this deck work, you can't even play them in the same deck. Like you can't put both of these cards in the same deck. You can't even say I'll try and play the Mitsurugi archetype with no Habakiris and one prayers and one. You just can't play it. So it's a banned list. It's banned. It's just banned. Like the deck is just banned. It's not a points list. And so as a result, like that feels kind of weird to me as well. And you're kind of mixing your intentions. Now they do say that they want specific combos to be priced out of the format. And I guess the theory is that you can price out a combo while still leaving the cards legal to be used in other more equitable or fair applications. And I'm sympathetic to that notionally. But I think in practice, boy, does that not happen very often. Like, I don't know. I'm not enough of a Yu-Gi-Oh player yet to be able to tell you, like, oh yeah, Gimmick Puppet Nightmare being at 70 is a shame because the OTK deck you can play with it isn't playable, but you could play it in some other deck. I mean, I know this card actually, and like you can't. Like this card at 70 means that every deck that would play this is dead. It can't play this card. Similarly, like Dododo Warrior, like this at 70, like more or less prices you out of ever being able to play the archetype that this card goes in. So like to me, there's this weird issue where they seem much more, Konami that is, seems much more comfortable with the notion of either pseudo banning cards, or in the case of making cards 100, like these cards are banned. Like you can't register these cards. It's not feasible to do so. And so I think that's the one other thing that I think is a little bit weird, is that we have like this points list that is ostensibly existing to allow flexibility in deck building, but many of the cards exist at a point value which allows no flexibility in deck building. And their stated reason for why they've done it this way is that they are suggesting that tournament organizers can run tournaments at whatever point value they want. So essentially they're saying, oh yeah, I mean, sure, we're saying 100 points is what the normal Genesis tournaments at competitive events will be run at, but you could run a 500 point Genesis event if you wanted to really go off the rails. And I think that kind of if you're trying to satisfy both the ability to maintain a stable playable 100 point format while also catering to the playability of like 500 point Genesis at your local tournament, I think you're ending up in a problemed state. So yeah, that was the last thing I wanted to say. I had another point. I want to be very clear. I've been enjoying playing Yu-Gi-Oh. And as a degenerate combo player in Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh suits me just fine. Like zero sum games don't bother me. I'm a big fan of taking 25 game actions while my opponent takes 2. So I've been having nothing but fun. But I do think that there are just some fundamental problems with the way that the format is designed, and I also think that the approach that they are trying to take is a bit of a cautionary tale. I think for us in the Canadian Highlander scene, I think it is a dangerous road to walk down to be trying to keep all of these fair cards pointed, unless we are going to drastically increase the cadence at which we are going to do the pointings. If we were going to commit to pointing on a higher cadence, I think it would be fine, and we could stay on top of it in a way that felt reasonable. But I think, anecdotally, this last year, because there were so few changes, has really felt like the kinds of archetypes that you've been allowed to play at a high level have felt pretty limited, and it felt like it was figured out relatively quickly. And people have kind of just been iterating on that same meta and trying to be on the right side of the triangle in that particular week, right? Are you playing the playable blue mid-range deck? Are you playing one of the Taxes decks that beats up on the combo decks? Or are you playing the combo decks that beats up on everything else in the format, except for the Taxes decks and maybe some of the blue mid-range decks? So yeah, that's all I've got for this week. I know this is a very different video. I hope you enjoyed it. I liked talking about this kind of stuff. I've enjoyed learning how to play Yu-Gi-Oh, and I think that, this Genesis format seems very interesting, and I really hope that they get it sorted out, because I do genuinely feel very strongly that points lists are a good way to manage format balance. But I do think that they are that they are maybe missing the mark a little bit currently, and I think that there's some stuff that they could be doing better. In particular, as it relates to new cards, I think that they really need to implement a policy where new cards come out at some arbitrary value, like 10 or something like that. They've got to find some way so that new engines aren't just coming out at 0, breaking the format for a month, and then subsequently landing at their correct points value, because the release cycle of product is going to be such that, like, you're just going to end up with an unplayable format for 3 or 4 months of the year, which seems bad. But yeah, without further ado, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.